Previously in the complete creation.
That's a fancy word for kills the organisms that are weaker. This is how evolution works. Yet God views death as an enemy. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. Hello again and welcome back. Last 3 parts of this series, and I've had to cut out so much content and it's been difficult to decide what to leave in and what to take out. For the future, please be sure to follow along the Genesis Week TV show and podcasts, which you can find at genesisweek.com. And those shows will be devoted to current events and will pick up the pieces that I had to cut out of this series. We're going to start off this lecture with a philosophical question. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Now, be aware, this is actually a trick question. It's actually a trick evolutionary question, and I'm going to give you the answer to this question that's baffled philosophers for generations now. Are you ready? Are you taking notes? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? The correct answer is, it was the chicken and the rooster. An egg by itself is useless. A chicken by itself is useless. You need a chicken and a rooster. Interestingly, this also brings up a significant challenge to evolutionism: the origin of reproduction. How can you evolve plants and animals in small incremental steps from a single-celled organism when they all have radically different, completely incompatible methods of reproduction? Even a chimp and a human cannot reproduce because their reproductive systems are so different. Any change to the reproductive system is fatal to the organism, and thus fatal to evolution. This was one of the fascinating topics I've had to cut from this series, but you can get the brief lowdown from my CrEvo Rant number 13, Ian's sex video. Just please be aware that this rant is rated PG-13 for adult content, really bad jokes and puns that aren't suitable for any age group, and because completely naked animals appear in the video. Ultimately, the reasons for this fatal blow to evolutionism has to do with information. We need to first get a grasp on what information is, because it's a non-physical construct imposed on the physical realm. In fact, let's take that construct and run with it for a second. If you look up non-physical in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, you'll see several synonyms for the word, including formless. I think it is profoundly significant when you read Genesis chapter 1, the very first 2 verses in the entire Bible and the entire creation account. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void. Void of what? It was formless and void of information. The earth was there, the elements were there, but they contained no information. God himself, the ultimate source of information, had yet to impose information onto the creation. Allow me to demonstrate what I mean. Take a look at these physical letters. Do these letters contain any information? No, they don't. But what about now? What changed? In like fashion, if you pour out a can of alphabet soup, you got a ton of letters. Surely there's information contained in there. No, actually, there isn't. Not until information is imposed upon the medium, which in this case is letters made of tasty pasta. But the medium used could be literally anything. For example, if we hear 3 short beeps, 3 long beeps, and 3 short beeps, we understand the information conveyed. Why? Because in the 1840s, inventors developed and refined the Morse code, which used different lengths of pulses in the forms of dots and dashes. This could be beeps, tapping, the clicking of a relay, or the flashing of a light, or even blinking eyelids, such as prisoner Jeremiah Denton Jr. did as a prisoner. Imagine walking out in the middle of nowhere and you see a bunch of sand and rocks. Would you conclude that this formation came about by strictly natural processes, unguided by any intelligence? Now, you're welcome to believe that it did, but I'll just say that your blind faith far surpasses mine. In all the examples I brought up, please note that the medium itself is not the information. The information is intelligence outside of and apart from the medium. The information has been imposed upon the medium by an outside intelligence. You'll notice we're also speaking in tongues here. We're using multiple languages, which are also separate from and imposed upon the medium. In order to convey information, you have to have a sender and receiver, and both have to agree on the method of communication. You have to agree upon the medium used, whether you are using pasta, rocks, blinking lights, or electrical signals, and the language. Just using alphabet soup isn't good enough. What if we wanted to communicate in Italian? Same letters, completely different language. Or we could use a completely different alphabet, like that used in Mandarin, or agree upon the ASCII code and communicate in binary. Or again, in Morse code, which, like using ASCII and binary, is technically using multiple languages at once. Now, of course, you have information written inside of you, in the cells in your body. I'm not talking about the information in your brain. That's a whole other ball of wax. I'm talking about the information on how to build you that's contained within the cells of your body. We call it the genetic code. In this particular case, the medium used to communicate the code is chemicals, which join together and take on this twisted ladder shape, double helix structure of our DNA. The backbone on the outside is the structure, but it's the rungs that actually contain the information. The rungs are composed of 4 chemicals which we call a base or nucleotide: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. Now, there's a fifth one called uracil, which I won't get into today, because our present study is on information, not genetics per se. We've assigned letters to these chemicals to interpret and represent the code A, T, C, and G. These rungs are called base pairs because each rung is composed of 2 bases joined together. Now, because of the chemical attractions and repulsions, A will only join to T and C will only join to G. So the DNA is encoded with the information by assembling the chemical bases in a specific sequence of the ladder. So you can read the code by going down the ladder this way: ACT, AG, AA, TCT, GG, T. But because of the nature of the DNA, we have a backup copy. You can read the DNA on the opposite side of the ladder. So if something happens to this side, we can rebuild that copy from the second copy. The DNA is blueprints for how to make every part of your body, including all the parts of every cell, and it's housed inside the nucleus of the cell. All of these different parts of the cell provide essential services in operating and maintaining the cell, as well as constructing new cells and communicating with other cells outside of itself. Yet the instructions on how to make every one of those parts comes from the DNA. But the DNA needs all of those other parts to even exist. When Jesus spoke to the crowds, he often did so in parables, earthly stories to explain heavenly things beyond what the people could see or understand. Hear ye therefore the parable of the self-sustaining space station. This space station is completely automated and can take in both energy and material from space and use it to not only maintain itself, but it has the ability and systems to build other stations just like it. It has a power plant, which takes raw materials and provides the electrical power to run everything in the station, like the factory that makes the parts for everything. There are construction robots, which can drive or fly, taking those parts and installing them as the station builds another station or replaces parts that need replacing within itself. It can also build other construction robots. Everything is contained and held together by the space station's frame and dome. Without it, there is nothing to keep everything from falling apart and drifting their own separate ways to the nether regions of space. All the blueprints for everything are contained in the engineering building's data center computers, which provide the blueprints on how to build everything. The power plant, the parts factory, the construction robots, the space station frame and dome, and yes, even the engineering building's data center and blueprints. The construction robots read the blueprints to know how to build and maintain everything. But the construction robots and the parts factory are needed to make the blueprint data center and the engineering building itself. And just like files on your computer, the blueprints get damaged over time. And new computers with copies of the blueprints also need to be made for the construction of other space stations. The construction robots need to interpret the damaged blueprint files and fix the errors, as well as making a new computer data center and copies of all blueprints, with the parts provided by the parts factory. The engineering building provides the blueprints that the parts factory follows to make the millions of individual parts that made up everything, including the parts that make up the engineering building, the blueprints and data center, the power plant, all of the construction robots, and even the space station frame and dome itself. The parts factory also makes the parts for fixing the parts factory or for making new parts factories in new space station constructions. The engineering building is needed to house the data center of blueprints, which are needed by the parts factory and construction robots, so they can build the engineering building and its data storage facilities. The parts factory, construction robots, blueprints from the engineering building are all needed to construct the power plant. But the power plant is what powers the parts factory, the construction robots, and the engineering building. The parts factory, construction robots, the power plant, and the blueprints from the engineering building are all needed to build the space station frame and dome, but the space station frame and dome are needed to keep everything together under one roof. None of them can exist without the other. So, which came first? The blueprints, the engineering building, construction robots, power plant, parts factory, or the space station frame and dome? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Or is this another non sequitur trick question? Because the correct answer is that the blueprints, engineering building and data center, construction robots, power plant, parts factory, frame, and dome all were created at the same time. A designer who imposed an infinitesimally small amount of his infinite information on the DNA, the blueprints, the countless millions of chemicals assembled together to make all of these structures within seconds of each other, so they could all continue on after the fact in a self-sustaining, codependent cycle. Geneticist Dr. John Sanford, co-inventor of the gene gun, was formerly an evolutionary atheist and is now an ardent young Earth creationist. He compiled a book he titled Genetic Entropy. He actually did a really good job of explaining incredibly technical topics in a surprisingly easy to understand way. I also put together a summary of his work in CrEvo Rant number 78, Genetic Entropy, and will summarize Sanford's arguments here, as well as another significant point which I detail in CrEvo Rant number 35, Problem Solved. As you are already aware, your DNA has been passed down to you generation after generation. Every generation basically mixes the DNA of a father and mother who pass it on to their child. However, every generation introduces mistakes in the copies of the DNA. Now, they're small mistakes, perhaps 100 or so base pairs out of 3 billion, but that child also introduces another 100 or so mistakes into their DNA, and thus when they have a child, they pass on around 200 mistakes. The next generation introduces another 100 mistakes or so, and so on and so on. This is called genetic load, and obviously it increases over time. This is what is observed. This is not speculation or wishful thinking. Think of it like copying a book, and every copy introduces minor mistakes. Swapping out a letter for another random one, or deleting a letter, or sometimes even deleting an entire word. It's really not that big a deal, and you can still read the book because of the context and the previously agreed upon rules of communication. But the more generations, the more mistakes that are introduced, increasing the loss of information conveyed by the text. Eventually, so many mistakes accumulate that the book is no longer readable. In the case of the human genome, an unreadable genome means the person is dead. Now, look at this from a young Earth or old Earth perspective. First, notice that as you go back in time, the human genome has fewer and fewer errors. So as you go back in time, the human genome reaches original perfection. Adam and Eve were created perfect, and it was with the fall of man, the introduction of sickness and death into the world, that we are deteriorating, and fast. Within the context of a young Earth and a global flood, Noah was only 9 generations after Adam. And there are plenty of reasons to believe that the genetic loading was not the same before the flood as it is now. Yet, let's assume that it was, and assume an extremely conservative genetic loading of 100 point mutations per generation. That means roughly 4,500 years ago, the time of the flood, the genetic load on the entire population was probably less than 1,000 bases out of 3 billion. If we are extremely conservative and assume one generation every 40 years, then there's been roughly 112 generations, since the time of Noah. We would assume another accumulated 11,200 errors plus the 800 or so that we assume Noah had, giving us a genetic load of around 12,000 nucleotide errors. This would equate to roughly 1 out of every 250,000 nucleotides being the wrong base. From the perspective of an old Earth and evolutionism, depending on who you ask, it is assumed the first humans evolved around 300,000 years ago. Using all the same extremely conservative figures, our genome should have accumulated roughly 750,000 errors in the human genome, or 1 error for every 4,000 base pairs in the DNA. Now, that may not sound like much at first blush, but remember back to part 3 in the UFOs, Aliens, and Genesis miniseries that interrupted this series. We looked at what was required to make one protein a mere 200 amino acids long. Those construction robots in your cells can book along at assembling proteins at about 20 amino acids per second. And, like Lego, it had to get the sequence exactly correct, or else the protein would not be formed correctly. And just like Lego, your construction wouldn't work. One protein synthesized in your liver is human serum albumin, which is encoded 1 amino acid at a time from a specific gene in your DNA that's 16,961 nucleotides long. That protein is critical for life. You are dead without it. But if your DNA was actually 7,500 generations old, then there would be an average of 4 errors just in the gene for that protein alone. This would lead to producing the wrong amino acid in the chain, which would lead to a corrupted protein, which wouldn't do its job. You would be dead. This problem of genetic load accumulating through deep time was so severe and so overwhelmingly fatal for the evolution myth that it caused Alexei Kondrashov, a believer in evolution, to subtitle his paper, "Why Have We Not Died 100 Times Over?" He is absolutely correct in his analysis. The deep time required by evolution accumulates a fatal dose of genetic errors. We should be extinct just from the genetic load and the incredible loss of information in the human genome. I might point out that this is only a problem for evolutionism in deep time. Not just that the genetic load over evolutionary time periods is fatal, but that this is a loss of information in the genome, which is the exact opposite of what is required by evolution. Evolution requires that we gain information over time. Instead, what we scientifically observe is that we are losing genetic information, and alarmingly fast. The young Earth special creation model has no problem with these scientific observations from genetics. Information, which we might call knowledge, is only ever observed to come from greater information. In genetics, the information is lost generation to generation, so that as you go back in time, you find greater and greater information. In other words, there was a supreme information, an infinite information or infinite knowledge, omniscience. We would call this God. Now, just to give you an idea of how omniscient the original source of information was, let's take a very fast look at how the information was written. And this is only what we have figured out so far. You remember those construction robots I mentioned? They are little nanobots that ride down the backbone of the DNA, well, like a monorail, reading the code. While they normally read on one side, going in one direction, they can also read sections going backwards. This is like reading a book and getting a second story embedded in the pages of the book by reading the letter sequence backwards. Sometimes the nanobots will read the opposite side of the DNA strand. So when reading the opposite bases, it reads still yet more information coded in the same strand. It can also read that side backwards. and read still yet more information embedded in the same strand by reading the letters backwards on the second side of the strand. In viruses, the genome is incredibly small, and so more information needs to be packed into fewer bases. In some viruses, the genome is read in a circle. The nanobot starts reading the DNA strand at the beginning, and as it runs down the length of the strand, it effectively joins the tail end of the strand with the strand at the head end, forming a loop in the monorail. That nanobot reads right off the tail end of the strand, keeps reading, and continues on past the start of the strand again. This is like reading a book, reading right off the end of the book, and continuing on the story by reading the first sentence of the book. But Sturgis et al. From the University of Washington, writing in Science magazine in 2013, uncovered that there was actually a second layer of information encoded in the DNA, written in a different language. You remember English and Italian use the same alphabet, right? So imagine a page in a book that if read in English, you get one story. But reading the same page in Italian, you get a second story. I can't even give you an example because I'm not intelligent enough to make an example. Our Creator is hyper-intelligent and omniscient. All right, I'm out of time for this part. Please join me again next week where we'll look at evidence for creation.
Coming up in the next Complete Creation.
How do we know it's a herring? Because it looks like one. 45 million years of evolution has caused the herring to evolve into a herring.
You can catch the entire series in a variety of ways. You can watch the show online at www.completecreation.org or www.genesisweek.com. You can also purchase the Complete Creation series in full high definition on Blu-ray or video on demand at completecreation.org. Or support the Miracle Channel with a monthly tax-deductible donation and access the entire Complete Creation series in high definition through Corco, Miracle Channel's video on demand service. We need your support to keep this program on the air, so please pray for us. And if you wish to financially support the program, Canadians can make a tax-deductible donation to Core Ottawa, Canada North Post Office Box 72075, Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, K2K2P4. Or you can make a donation via PayPal online at ianjuby.org/donations. And thank you for your support.